Well, thank you again for having us in your home. We have really intense presentation today. We are in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15. We are going through the story of Jesus and his crucifixion. And we're moving through the trial, we're moving through each one of these parts. And as we go on this journey, Mark has recorded it in a really amazing and very simple way. And keep in mind, we are just doing the Gospel of Mark. What we want to do is just let you hear one gospel in its entirety. Because in the Gospel of Mark, you find the good news that we are saved by faith alone in Jesus Christ, that we are not saved by doing our duty or right behavior. In fact, the story tells us that it's attempting to do our right behavior is the opposite of trusting and walking by faith in Jesus. So I hope you're blessed with our presentation today. And I'd like to just take a moment and go to our beginning photograph, Sherry. We are again right here on the Pacific Coast. That morning fog would roll in. This is about 8 o'clock in the morning. And as soon as that sun hits that coastline, all that fog just begins to dissipate, and that's what you're seeing right here. It's thinning out. It's almost ready to just all be gone and leave that beautiful blue ocean there. So Sherry, thank you for just capturing that moment for us. I hope you enjoy the things that Sherry brings us. So, Gospel of Mark, chapter 15. This is part 1. It is called Jesus Before Pilate. Hang on, because this is going to be intense. In our last presentation, we addressed the issue that in the late hours of night, in fact, in the middle of the night, they had a trial for Jesus, which was a violation of their own Jewish law. So when we get to Mark chapter 15, verse 1, Mark records early in the morning. This would be very early in the morning, way earlier than what you would normally be doing these kinds of things, because they've had an all-night trial. So keep in mind the inconvenience now for Pilate, because they actually have to get him out of bed. And I want you to think about the attitude of the individuals in this story. So Pilate is somewhat inconvenienced here. Well, let's jump into the story. Mark chapter 15, verse 1. Early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and scribes and the whole council immediately held a consultation. And binding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Now, Jesus is before Pilate. He's bound, so he can't escape. He is standing in the court of Pilate and surrounded by soldiers, as if he is some kind of criminal. He has been condemned already in the court of the Sanhedrin. But as I have already told you, and we will probably understand this and repeat it again, is that the Jewish officials could not convict Jesus and sentence him to death. So he has been condemned in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, by the priests. The Jewish officials that brought Jesus to Pilate will not enter the court area. They will stand at the entrance, because their understanding to be in the Roman presence, to be in the presence of the Roman governor, that would make them unclean. And why would that be a problem? Because if they were unclean, they could not participate in the Passover, which is coming shortly. So, the false trial, the fear of uncleanliness, while completely unable to see themselves as plotting to have Rome murder Christ, by the way, who is innocent, kind of seems strange to us as we look from the outside into the story. There's a really important lesson here for us. What's true then as a principle is true today. Self-righteousness has the ability to blind a person. It has the ability to blind you and me. Are you ready for this? From the truth of ourselves, to make us think we are something we are not. And this is true in this story of the Sanhedrin. They saw themselves as righteously pursuing an issue to save Israel, when in fact they were plotting to have Rome murder Christ. Now just let that sink in for just a bit here. Now let's go back to Pilate. He's been interrupted from his sleeping in the morning. It's in the early hours, as the text said. He's anxious to get this thing done with. The priests need to convict him. I'm sorry, let me restate that. The priests need him, that's Pilate, to convict and judge Jesus as guilty. So with the Jewish leaders standing back at the entrance, Jesus now is standing right in front of Pilate. And he, the Pilate, is wondering, who is this criminal? Because Jesus doesn't look like a criminal. Now, keep in mind that Pilate knows more about Jesus than we realize. So here's Jesus. He's standing calm. His dignity is fully intact. He has no appearance of guilt, as many who do come before Pilate. And Pilate can see that. Jesus appears, in fact, fearless. But at the same time, kindness is going to emanate from his words in this conversation, and it is noticeable during the trial. Now remember, Pilate knows about Jesus' work. His own people, the soldiers, were blessed by Jesus' ministry of healing, of resurrections. I mean, the stories are profound as Jesus touched the lives of Roman citizens. Pilate knows about this. Can you understand the problem he has in this story? The restored lives, nothing but good is in Pilate's mind about this man, Jesus. His crimes were presented by the priest. Accusations without facts, accusing Jesus of things, but presented as if they were true. The anger and the rage and the envy of the priests, that was all they had. This, to have been there and stand there and watch this, I think you would have been shocked. So the conversation begins. Let's now go back to Mark 15, and let's start with verse 2. It reads, Pilate questioned him, "Are you king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered him, "It is as you say." Now that's a vague answer, more vague than you realize. Okay? He's saying, this is what you said. It's a little different way of speaking for you and I. Today we would say, well, you said that. Verse 3, immediately the chief priests began to accuse him harshly. Remember what I told you? That they only have this rage and this anger and this intensity to make their accusations seem more real than what it actually is. Why do I say this? Because Jesus is completely innocent. Notice now verse 4. Then Pilate questioned him again, saying, "Do you not answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" Now notice this text very carefully. In other words, as they are hurling accusations, Jesus is silent. He's not saying anything. That's why Pilate says, "Do you not answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further answer. So Pilate, as Mark recorded, was amazed. Who is this man who is standing here so dignified? And by the way, probably has more the stature and appearance and the dignity of the true King of Israel than one could imagine, especially contrasted to the priests. Now, at the feast, Pilate used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested. So at the Passover, every year, they would come to Pilate, and what would Pilate offer to do? "I will release one of you." Maybe they had 20, maybe 100, maybe more, but you may choose one of the prisoners that is condemned, and I will release them. Now, isn't that just a gracious thing to do? What a kind thing to do. I mean, you kind of look at the Roman government and you could think all kinds of evil things, but they had built in some quite unique things. And please keep in mind that Rome is a republic, a form of democratic republic. And so they were trying to kind of appease this country that they had taken over that was once Israel, which is now belonging to the Roman Empire. And every year they would release a convict. That's amazing, isn't it? What a gracious thing to do. Now, listen to what Mark tells us here. This is vitally important to this story. Remember who Jesus is, the Son of God, the Son of Man. Now, notice what Mark records for us in verse 7. The man named Barabbas had been imprisoned with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the insurrection. So Barabbas is a man who is guilty of trying to overthrow the Roman government, involved in a murder. Now, why do I point this out to you? Because what is the contrast? It is the man Jesus Christ, who is innocent, who all he has done is he has healed, he has blessed, he has resurrected and restored broken families. He has done so much that one of the Gospels says that it wasn't even possible for a book to record everything that Jesus has done. So why is Mark introducing us to this insurrectionist involved in murder? Follow it carefully. The crowd went up, that's to Pilate, and began asking him to do as he had been accustomed for them. So there's no doubt the priests have put them up to this, okay? Because the priest's main concern is that the crowd would come and ask them to release Jesus. So obviously the priests are involved in this, and the crowd went up and began to ask him to do what had been a custom. And Pilate answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" For he was aware that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. Please make note of this. Pilate saw right through the facade. He assumed, hopefully, that they would demand the release of Jesus. He is not aware of the conspiracy that is about to unfold in front of him. Verse 11. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. In other words, they got a group in that crowd to begin to demand, "We want Barabbas." What a shocking thing. What a challenging thing. how do we even wrap our mind around this? Verse 12, answering again, Pilate, speaking hopefully here, hoping that the man Jesus, whom he has admired at this point, was hoping that he could release them, and he said to them again, then what shall I do with him whom you call the King of the Jews? I think, personally, that Pilate, who is a pagan by religion, is hoping that the Jewish people in their religion would see the good and the kindness and the miracles and the blessings that Jesus had done, and he was at a loss what to do with Jesus. Challenging story, isn't it? Now, pay careful attention here. This is verse 13. I'm going to put it right on your screen. They shouted back. This big crowd, crucify him. They got the rabble-rousers to get the crowd worked up and demand Pilate do what they could not do and crucify Jesus, putting the blame on the Roman government. Now that is an intense story. It's a complicated story. Verse 14, but Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? Now, keep in mind, they have no criminal charges they can actually give to Pilate. But they shouted all the more, crucify him. Now just imagine this scene. Imagine what Pilate is beginning to think about their religion at this point. What is wrong with these people? How can you do this? How can you demand an innocent man's death? What is it that causes you envy and fear at this level? Now things get real complicated here. When we get to verse 15, I want you to notice that Pilate gives in to the crowd. He's had enough of this. And let me read verse 15 to you. Wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them. And after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. Now, I want to pause here for just a moment. There's a word used here, scourged. We don't scourge people in our culture today. But what was about to happen to Jesus, I want you to just listen for a moment. To be scourged was to be beaten within the last moments of your life. It was to be beaten and having your skin broken open, to be bleeding. It was a violent attack by Roman soldiers against you, unlike anything you and I could imagine. In all of the movies where they have tried to convey what a scourging was, scholars have all that I have read said that none of the films have ever actually reflected what to be scourged meant in the Roman culture. So this brutally beaten Savior was handed over to be crucified. Just wrap your mind around that for just a moment. To satisfy those who were jealous. In verse 16, the soldiers took him away from the palace. That is a praetorium. That's the place where Pilate is hearing the case. They called together the whole Roman cohort. Now pay attention. They dressed, this is now speaking of Jesus, they dressed him up in purple, and after twisting a crown of thorns, they put it on him. They put it on him. And they begin to acclaim him, according to the one accusation, "Hail, King of the Jews." Now, I'm going to say if I was one of those priests and I heard them shouting, "Hail, King of the Jews," that would not sit well with me, because they didn't want that shouted out and proclaimed. But yet here the Roman soldiers in the scourging are proclaiming Jesus, King of the Jews. More truth to that than they realize, isn't there? Verse 19, they kept beating his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling and bowing. In other words, they're mocking him as they bow before him. Brutal, isn't it? Remember in the garden where Jesus is saying, "Not my will but thine, not mine but your will, Father." And the third time he accepted the Father's will, he was in full agreement as he took on himself the sin of the entire human race. And the Bible describes that out of the pores of his skin, where normally there would be perspiration, were blood coming out of his pores and dropping down on the ground. Sweating blood because of the burden of Jesus taking on the sin of the world. And in taking on that sin, he took on the sin of the soldiers beating him. He took on him the sin of accusation from the priests. And he took on himself your sin and mine. That's profound. And we accept that by faith, don't we? This is an intense story. But in the midst of that story is redemption for everyone involved in it, if they're willing to accept what Jesus had done for them. I want you to notice verse 20 now. After they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off him, put his own garments on him, and they led him out to crucify him. It says they pressed into service a passerby coming from the countryside, or from the country outside of the city. Because of the scourging, now bear with me, the artist has tried to convey this carefully, and I hope you can see this on your screen. There's Jesus with the crown of thorns down in the bottom right corner. But because of the scourging, there was no strength left in him to bear the weight of his own cross. And so they grabbed this guy out of the crowd and they pressed him into service, it says, to bear the cross for Jesus. Because Jesus had no strength left to do it. Simon of Cyrene is recorded, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was called to bear his cross. Let's pause here for a minute. Just process what we have discussed so far. Let's review. The last 3.5 years, the only thing that flowed out of the hands and the mouth of Jesus were miracles of providing food for thousands, the forgiving of sins that healed, rising from the dead children, restored hands, restored eyes. Think of the stories that had not been told, that could not be contained in a book for 3.5 years. every act of the compassion of Jesus was a manifestation of the truth of who God is. Jesus said in the Gospel of John, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Remember doubting Thomas, if you have seen me, you've seen the Father. Jesus' demonstration in his everyday life, in his contact with humanity, from the day his ministry began at the wedding until this moment in the story, out of Jesus flowed the compassion, the kindness, the healing, and the restoration of his Father. So that you and I could accept by faith, by simply saying yes to Jesus, to accept his forgiveness for our own sins, that he was willing to pay the penalty in full for. That is eternal death, so that he could gift to you and to me eternal life. That's profound, isn't it? Absolutely profound. I want to go to our closing picture here in these last moments. The picture that we have up, Sherry is actually looking straight up into a storm that was moving over us in an attempt to form in a circular pattern tornadoes. And she caught the glimpse of the sun hitting the clouds, a touch of blue sky there, that turmoil. Thank you, Sherry. What a way to close our story today. Go back and read this story for yourself. I hope you're blessed. Thank you for letting us come into your home now. Take care.